I've been in transhumanism for about as long as modern transhumanism has existed. There have been various precursors. It's hard to say exactly where things start, but back in 1990 I wrote an essay called Transhumanism Toward a Futurist Philosophy. And people had used the word transhuman before, but in the modern sense nobody really created a philosophy of transhumanism. So I was really the first person to do that and developed what we call the principles of extropy, which is a particular transhumanist philosophy. And I've had a very long interest in life extension, started practicing life extension and being intellectually interested in the idea since well before I stopped growing. In my early 20s, I started the first cryonics organization in England, and I'm currently the president and CEO of the Alcohol Life Extension Foundation, which is the world's leading cryopreservation organization. The singularity to me seems to be a little bit too singular. It seems to assume that all these different technologies converge and take off all at the same pace, whereas in my view, we're more likely to see a surge which might tailor off, might slow down. In fact, it may be a series of surges. Information technology may improve at a different rate than biological technology, than nanotechnology, and so on. I don't think these all are necessarily coordinated. I can see the argument for that. If everything is driven by superintelligence, then perhaps that drives everything else. But I think that rather ignores economic and organizational factors and consumer adoption factors and so on. So I tend to think that what we'll see is the same as we've seen historically, but speeded up, which is that certain technologies will take off at a very accelerated pace, and it looks like we're hitting a singularity, but then they may actually slow down for a while, and then they may take off again, typical S-curve. And there may be a whole series of these, rather than one singular event. I tend to think that the idea of a singularity is a little bit seductive. It's very appealing, and it has certain historical, religious, and mythical reverberations that I think kind of attract people to that idea. But I think it may be a more complex picture than that. Well, by a surge, I'm really meaning that part of what's usually called the singularity, where we see a rapid increase in the growth rate of a technology, the kind of exponential growth. But it kind of includes the idea, if it's a surge, that implies that it doesn't last forever. And it kind of gradually tails off, it flattens off. Whereas the singularity, if you look at the curves, they seem to be exponential until they become vertical, and you get an infinite rate of change in a finite amount of time. So the idea of a surge is that, yes, we do feel these sudden rushes forward, like with, for instance, aerospace technology. We got some very rapid advances from the Wright brothers onwards. There was rapid changes. And now it's pretty much slowed down, even though there was some continued progress in military aircraft. Still, we don't really see planes get any faster. We're not seeing Mach 20, Mach 50 planes. That's pretty much slowed down. So there you had a surge in the 20th century, and that's kind of petered out now. The Omega point idea, as developed by Frank Tipler, the physicist, does build on Teilhard de Chardin's idea of this idea of a kind of intellectual realm driven by computing power, very much on the lines of the singularity view, that reaches an infinite state where essentially every atom of matter in the universe eventually becomes part of a thinking device. And in Tipler's particular view, that seems to become a single mind. Now, I don't know why, even if matter was replaced, well, it was converted entirely into thinking matter, I'm not sure why a single mind would be the result. But I think he's been driven again by the sort of Judeo-Christian tradition of a singular mind. And so in his view, we have almost infinite computing power, and that could in principle resurrect everybody who ever lived by simulating all possible people who ever existed. And in his idea, they would come back into the simulated reality, which would be much like a heaven. So it seems very conveniently to fit the Judeo-Christian worldview, so I'm not sure it's going to happen that way at all. But I think in broad outlines, his general picture is kind of plausible, this idea that we will increasingly turn unthinking matter into thinking matter. And if you look long enough ahead, millions, billions, trillions of years into the future, it seems a fairly plausible picture of the general direction. That matter will essentially be turned into thinking matter, into consciousness. Not in any mystical sense, simply that we'll be using lots and lots of matter for computing, which means our minds can be vastly greater, vastly more powerful, and the world will be unimaginably different. I think that people, when they look at the future, if they do accept this idea that there are going to be drastic changes and great advances, they will necessarily try to fit that very complex, impossible to really understand future into very familiar mental models, because they want to put things in boxes, they want to feel like they have some kind of grip on that. So I won't be surprised to see, Christian transhumanists and Mormon transhumanists and even Buddhist transhumanists and every other group will have some kind of set of these ideas that will gradually accept them, but they'll make their future world fit with their pre-existing views as to how it will be. And I think that the essence of transhumanism is not religious. It's really based on humanism. It's an extension of humanism, hence transhumanism. It's really based on the ideas of reason and progress and enlightenment and a kind of a secularism. But that doesn't mean it's incompatible with trying to make certain of the transhumanist ideas of self-improvement, of enhancement. I think those are potentially compatible with at least non-fundamentalist forms of religion. Back in, I think, 1993, I wrote an essay called On Becoming Posthuman, and I wrote that for Free Inquiry magazine, which is probably the premier humanist publication in the United States, the invitation of the editor. And that was a very interesting experience because he told me the response, first of all, it was a huge response. He got more letters responding to it than he had in any previous article. And he said they're pretty evenly divided, 50-50, but half of them said, this is really fascinating, I'd like to know more about this, it sounds like a good idea. And the other half thought this is a terrible idea because it was challenging humanism. It was challenging the idea that we should just be the best humans we can be, because we're saying we can become something more than human. So those people sort of clung on to the current idea of the human, whereas I think the other half understood that we're really building on humanism. And there is this tradition that humanism has the ideas of progress, of reason, of looking past all the artificial boundaries between us, the racial and gender boundaries and so on. It's all about improving everybody's condition. So I see transhumanism as a direct descendant of the Enlightenment humanist project of challenging every orthodox belief, challenging everything that we currently accept and saying, why can't we do better? And pushing that not just to improving society, just improving education, but asking fundamental questions. Why can't we improve human biology? Why can't we change our genome? Just because it's the way it is doesn't mean it's as good as it can be. Why do we age and die? Why can't we do something about that? So to me, transhumanism is the natural successor to humanism in a positive sense. People tend to make an apparently clear distinction between treating a disease or a dysfunction, therefore getting a cochlear implant or a new heart valve, on the one hand, and enhancement on the other. A true enhancement would mean essentially becoming something better than you are, or higher functioning, perhaps better than any human being is. But that distinction is really pretty blurry the more you look at it. And I think really it's a matter of habit and of what you're used to, because if you get a heart valve replacement, you're just getting back to a very familiar baseline, whereas a more radical enhancement is something new. However, I think what we'll see is that as these become available and tested and safe, that people will very quickly forget their objections. It'll be very much like, say, open heart surgery. When that was first introduced, most people, wouldn't realize this now, but most people were horrified by the idea. I mean, not really surprisingly if you think about it. We're talking about cutting your chest open and sticking your hands in there and moving things around and sewing things up. That actually is a fairly gruesome idea. But now we think, oh, okay, if I have to have it done, I'm not looking forward to it, but everybody does it. I think if we have life extension technologies, if we have cognitive upgrades, people will very quickly realize the benefits and advantages of those, and their apparent, in principle, objections will very quickly disappear. It's certainly true that we've always extended ourselves physically and cognitively. We've used external calculating devices like the abacus, for a long time. We've used various kinds of artificial teeth, actually, for many centuries. So, yeah, and stones, obviously, to increase our ability to cut and to stab and to build things. So, yes, we've extended the body and the mind for many, many years. I don't really call that transhuman. I tend to reserve that term for something that really makes a fundamental change in the human condition. And by the human condition, if that's not to be arbitrary, I think it has to mean defined by our genes, because that's what separates us from other species. So if our genes then lead to a certain kind of brain development, a certain ability in the range of visual acuity, of auditory perception, which are limited by the way our genes have built us, then when we start talking about directly altering those genes to give us abilities beyond that, or implanting devices, or doing some of the re-engineering of the human body or brain that allows us to have perceptual and cognitive and emotional ranges beyond that of any human being, then we can talk about transhuman. So wearing contact lenses doesn't really make you transhuman, but it's all part of the same process of augmenting ourselves. Yeah, the Humanity Plus conference I talked about essential transhumanism, and the reason I chose that was that this was the first transhumanist conference in Asia, and it seemed to me many people may not have a clear idea of what transhumanism is. They'd heard many talks about various particular aspects, certain technologies, whether it's robotics or AI or biotechnology, but they may be wondering, well, how does this all fit together? What exactly is transhumanism? And since transhumanism, modern transhumanism started in, say, the late 80s onward, it's really flowered and grown and developed in all kinds of many different directions. And so it can be confusing to actually isolate what is the core of that. So I was trying to get to that. I was pointing out how certain ideas had been emphasized, perhaps overemphasized, and people were thinking that was transhumanism. But really the core of transhumanism is the idea of using reason, science, and technology backed by goodwill to overcome fundamental human limits, to live longer than we've ever lived, to become smarter, to become emotionally better than we've ever been. That is the core of it. All the other things are details. The particular technologies are not the essence of it. Maybe we'll use nanotechnology, maybe we'll use some other method, maybe we'll use biotechnology. So it's good to have arguments about which technology is most effective and most promising, but that's not the core of what defines transhumanism. It's defined by its values of progress and reason and optimism and challenging limits, and by using, pursuing that relentlessly. That's really what transhumanism is, essentially.